Hey everyone, we are finally in Esther chapter 8. If you want to go back and watch discussions on the previous Esther chapters, they are on my YouTube page. So I'm going to read the entire chapter and then we're going to go back and discuss each verse. So Esther chapter 8. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jews' enemy unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is, the month Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants and deputies and rulers of the provinces which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely, upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, the copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day, and many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Okay, so let's go back to verse 1 and start talking about Esther chapter 8. It says, On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jews' enemy unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. So it was custom that when a criminal was executed, everything they owned became property of the king. And it says in verse 1 that King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman to Esther. So the king was able to do whatever he wanted with Haman's property, and he gives it to his queen Esther. And it says, And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. So Esther is telling the king that Mordecai is her cousin. So Esther reveals Mordecai is her cousin, and Haman, who had bragged about his position, his wealth, his children, he is now dead, and now there is nothing left to pass down to his family even, because the king has all of Haman's property, estate, his wealth, all of that, and he has given the house to Esther. So verse 2 says, And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Esther was given Haman's house, and because it was a gift from the king, she could not give that to Mordecai, but she sets him in charge of the house. Okay? And let's take a minute and talk about the king and his ring. So that signet ring was given to Haman. Now, before Haman is executed, the king takes that ring back from Haman. So the signet ring was back on the king's finger after he had no doubt taken it off of Haman's finger before his death. the king gives the ring to Mordecai, and Esther, of course, sets Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Haman thought his plot to kill Mordecai would succeed. But now Haman is dead, and Mordecai is over Haman's house, and he has Haman's old position and the signet ring that was once on Haman's finger. He is second in command of the kingdom now. So let's take a minute and talk about the ring, though. The signet ring. We know that whoever the king gave his signet ring to, it was as if he was giving them authority. So we see this in Esther 3:10 when King Xerxes gives Haman the signet ring to make the commandment to kill the Jews. So signet, the definition of that is a small seal, especially one set with a ring, used instead of or with a signature to give authentication to an official document. So they were given authority to act as king, using the king's voice, and this was shown through different times throughout the Bible. So let's look at Genesis chapter 41, verses 41 through 43. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck, and made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. Okay, so let's go to Haggai chapter 2, verse 23. In that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, saith the Lord, and will make thee as a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. So the Lord chose Zerubbabel to be as a signet ring. So I really liked this commentary that said, this is as if the Lord is saying this to Zerubbabel. You are my ring, you are my authority, you are my presence on earth. You bear my mark and will leave my imprint on everything you touch. So if we think about that and we look at Luke 15:11 through 32, that is the story of the prodigal son. But looking at verse 22 specifically, but the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe, and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, and shoes on his feet. So the father was giving the son authority. And if you look at Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, it says, And Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, All power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore, and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the world. Amen. And if we look at Luke 10:19, to his disciples Jesus said, Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you. So, talking about this signet ring, and looking at all these verses we just read, you have been given the authority of the King by the King of Kings. The Lord is working through you. You are the voice of Jesus. You are the hands and the feet of Jesus. He has given you his signet ring. He has given you authority to tread on serpents and to do all these things and to go out and preach the gospel. So the King of Kings has given you a signet ring to be as a signet ring, to have his authority. Okay, let's get back to Esther and look at verses 3 and 4. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. So Esther goes before the king again, and she's falling down in tears, and I'm wondering if, because it says that he extended the scepter out to her again, if she has went to him again unannounced. It doesn't say that, but we know that some time has passed since the day that Haman was executed. And it sounds like she has went to him again unannounced, because he holds out the golden scepter towards her. Okay, verse 5. And said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. So Esther does not lay blame to the king, which was very smart on her part, but she says this was devised by Haman, even though it was the king that gave Haman that authority to use his ring, and he pretty much okayed this decree. She does not blame the king. Okay, Esther 8 and 6. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So she's pleading with the king, and she asks him two questions. And this is like something that Jesus does in the Bible a lot, or even God. He asks a question already knowing the answer. It's like a rhetorical question to make you think. She's asking the king two questions. How can I endure this? He's not going to actually answer those questions, but she's trying to say, of course I can't endure this. I can't stand for this. Verses 7 and 8. Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. So the king cannot reverse what was already written in the previous decree. So he reminds them that Haman has been hanged, Esther has been given the house of Haman, and the king tells Mordecai to make a new decree for the Jews and seal it with his ring. So he is again giving someone authority to use his ring, as if he has not already learned his lesson about what happened before doing that. So he is trusting someone good this time, though. We know Mordecai is a humble man and a servant of the Lord, and that's probably a good thing that the king is trusting Haman to use his ring. So if we look at another time that a law could not be reversed, but it turned out for the good, everything turned out okay, let's go to Daniel chapter 6. Okay, in Daniel 6, this is talking about Darius, and this is actually Xerxes' father. So Xerxes is the king who is married to Esther, King Ahasuerus, and Darius is his father. So there was a decree. Let's just go to verse 4 on Daniel 6. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, forasmuch as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king, and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute, and to make a firm decree, that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. So we're in the same area, same provinces, Medes and Persians. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. So nothing changed with Daniel praying to his God. He acted as he always did, even though a decree was sent out and signed by the king. Okay, so then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. So they're saying Daniel's still praying. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men assembled unto the king, and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is, that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed. So this is again talking about the decrees by the king. They cannot be changed. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. And the stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet, and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. So I read a commentary that was talking about that the stone was brought over the den of lions, and that they probably put some sort of wax or something there, and then sealed it with the signet. That way they could tell that it was not broken, that they was not trying to get Daniel out of there. Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste into the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouth, that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Okay, and then it goes on. But the point is that this was the same area where Esther was, and the same law was that if a king signed a decree, it could not be undone. And it's interesting that this was Xerxes' father Darius, and it all ties together. I just love that. Okay, so let's go on to back at Esther chapter 8, verses 9 and 10. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants and deputies and rulers of the provinces, which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. So the scribes were called in on the 3rd month. And if we look at Esther 3 and 7, it says the 1st month. So a little over 2 months have passed since the first decree was sent out. So for 2 months, the Jews have had to live in this fear of this upcoming day that they would be slaughtered. So in Esther 4 and 3, it talks about the weeping and wailing of the Jews when they heard this decree. Many times throughout the Bible, God delivered the Israelites when they cried out to him. So there was weeping and wailing, and we can imagine that for 2 months, the Jews were living in fear of this upcoming day. And if we look at the different times in the Bible that the Israelites cried out to God, let's look at Exodus 2:23 through 24. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So let's look at the cycle of the book of Judges now. Israel serves the Lord. Israel falls into sin. Israel is enslaved. Israel cries out to the Lord. God raises up a judge. Israel is delivered. Israel serves the Lord, and the cycle repeats over and over again. But the Lord always hears their cries. Psalm 18 and 6 says, In my distress I called upon the Lord, and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even into his ears. So for the months after the first decree was made to kill all Jews, we can imagine that they were crying out to God, and we know that God always hears us. So if you look at verse 10, just a little side note, it talks about the young dromedaries. So dromedaries are an Arabian camel trained for riding or racing. So they are more lightweight than camels. They only have one hump, and they were built for speed pretty much. So they were sending out that second decree pretty fast. Okay, let's now look at verses 11 through 14. Wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, the copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment. And the decree was given at Shushan the palace. So it says they could gather themselves together, so like an army. The law written by Mordecai allowed the Jews to defend themselves against any and all that would cause harm to them. The first decree possibly implies that it would be against the law to help the Jews during the planned attack. So it was written to command the officials to kill every Jew in a mass extermination. The second decree plainly gives the Jews the go-ahead to defend themselves against any and all power, so that means the government officials, that would harm them. One commentary says every leader knew the message from the king was clear. They weren't to bother, harass, or kill any Jews. So they reversed the decree without breaking the law, without breaking the law and changing the decree or admitting that the king's first decree was wrong. So it was implied, you don't touch the Jews. The second decree overrules the first one. Okay, verses 15 through 17. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for fear of the Jews fell upon them. So the people rejoiced with Mordecai, who in chapter 3 we saw was wearing sackcloth, and now he is arrayed in royal apparel. What a change. The Jews are feasting and celebrating. The Lord has heard their cry. Many of the people became Jews for fear, either fear because they recognized the divine work of Haman being hung and the second decree being issued, or fears of what the Jews would do to them. Either way, they became Jews, and as it says in verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. So that is Esther chapter 8, and soon we will be finishing the book of Esther, and I'm so excited. God bless you.